Victory Day, May 9th, 1945, and the streets of Moscow are filled with a massive parade. Soldiers march, tanks roll, and Soviet flags flutter in the wind. But the air is thick with more than just celebration. As thousands cheer, a chilling figure watches from the Kremlin. Joseph Stalin, the man who crushed Nazi Germany, the man who now stands as the supreme ruler of the Soviet Union. Yet, as his people cheer, something far darker pulses beneath the surface. On this momentous day, Stalin's victory is complete, but this hero is far from the beloved leader he appears to be. A man who led with an iron fist, Stalin is the architect of terror, a dictator whose actions would condemn millions to an agonizing fate. As the crowd shouts his name, he is responsible for a massacre on an unimaginable scale, one that has yet to be fully understood by the world. His rule is a dark testament to absolute power. Stalin didn't just defeat Hitler, he crushed his own people in the process. His legacy is written in the blood of millions, his crimes against humanity buried under layers of propaganda, deceit, and brutality. But how did a seemingly insignificant man rise from the shadows to control the fate of the Soviet Union, instigating one of the most horrifying regimes in history? Real quick, if you haven't already, please take the next few seconds to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support truly means a lot. Thanks so much, and now let's jump right back into the video. Born Yosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili in 1878 in the remote town of Gori, Georgia, his early years were far from the story of a future world dictator. Raised in a harsh environment with an abusive alcoholic father and a frail mother, Stalin's formative years were shaped by suffering. His father would beat him relentlessly, while his mother, a deeply religious woman, would send him to an Orthodox seminary, hoping that the church might give him a stable future. But the church would not tame him. It would fuel his rage. The poverty-stricken streets of Gori shaped a young Stalin's sense of injustice. He soon became drawn to revolutionary ideologies. By the time he was in his 20s, he had joined the revolutionary movement, taking the name Stalin, which means man of steel, a reflection of the tough, unwavering figure he intended to become. In 1903, Stalin joined the Bolshevik faction under Vladimir Lenin. His role was far from glorious, but Stalin had a ruthless ambition that would later catapult him to power. For years, he operated in the shadows, carrying out small missions, handling logistics, and slowly building a network of loyal supporters. But Stalin was biding his time, watching, planning. He was no idealist. He was a man driven by a hunger for power. In 1924, Lenin died. It was the spark Stalin had been waiting for. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, had died after a long illness. The Soviet Union was left in a state of uncertainty. Lenin was revered, but Stalin had already taken steps to ensure his position would not be undermined. While Lenin lay dying, Stalin had already moved behind the scenes, consolidating power within the Communist Party. He controlled key positions that would give him leverage, including the Secretary General of the Communist Party, an administrative role that seemed insignificant, but gave Stalin enormous influence over the party's structure. At Lenin's funeral, Stalin appeared the part of the grieving leader, but in private, his actions were far more calculating. In his bid for power, he ruthlessly outmaneuvered his political rivals, most notably Leon Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary leader. Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man, the hero of the revolution. But Stalin had no qualms about having him exiled. He wasn't done yet. Stalin's ultimate goal was not just to be Lenin's successor, but to dominate and rewrite the history of the Soviet Union. Stalin's ascent to power was not immediate, and his rise to absolute authority came after years of political maneuvering. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had become the uncontested leader of the Soviet Union, and as he rose, he immediately began making his mark on the country, not through reform, but through terror and control. Stalin's first major move was collectivization. He forced millions of peasants to give up their land and work on massive collective farms, a policy that would result in widespread famine, especially in Ukraine, where millions of innocent civilians died as a direct result of Stalin's policies. Yet, for Stalin, the suffering of the masses was irrelevant compared to his vision of industrialization. He launched massive construction projects aimed at transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower. Steel mills, factories, power plants, these were his dreams, his legacy. But in the process, he did not just build the Soviet Union, he broke its spirit. People were worked to the bone in horrific conditions, and any dissent was crushed immediately. His rule was marked by brutality and fear. The Gulag system, a network of forced labor camps, grew exponentially, and Stalin's paranoia saw even the smallest sign of disloyalty crushed. Families, communities, entire towns were destroyed in his pursuit of absolute power. Despite the horrors he inflicted on his people, Stalin's image outside the Soviet Union was cultivated as that of a hero, a leader who had defeated Nazi Germany and rebuilt a nation from the ruins of war. To the West, Stalin was a force for good. In fact, many Western intellectuals and politicians admired him, completely blind to the atrocities he was committing at home. In 1939, Stalin made a deal with Hitler, the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which shocked the world. For a time, the two men, brutal dictators of diametrically opposed ideologies, worked together. But Stalin's ultimate aim was clear. He wanted to secure Soviet power and expand its influence across the globe, no matter the cost. And so, the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule began its descent into terror. A man once underestimated by his peers would become one of the deadliest dictators the world had ever seen, ruling over a vast empire of suffering and silence. The Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 is often referred to as Stalin's darkest hour, an era where fear gripped every corner of the Soviet Union. As Stalin solidified his grip on power, his paranoia spiraled out of control. He feared betrayal, real or imagined, from every faction in his government. This fear would lead to one of the most brutal purges in modern history, leaving millions dead or imprisoned. The stage was set. Stalin had already eliminated Leon Trotsky, his greatest rival, but now he began to target anyone who could challenge his reign. Old Bolsheviks, war heroes, intellectuals, and even the common people were swept up in a wave of arrests, trials, and executions. In 1936, Stalin's political rivals within the Communist Party were accused of treason, spying, and conspiracy against the state. The show trials became a grotesque spectacle of political manipulation. Stalin knew that the public would need a justification for the arrests, and so he staged these trials where innocent men were forced to confess to crimes they did not commit. These confessions, often extracted under torture, were used as evidence to justify the executions of thousands. In the infamous Moscow trials, several of Stalin's closest comrades, including Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin were arrested. Bukharin, once Stalin's ally and a key architect of the revolution, was falsely accused of plotting against Stalin. Despite a life spent working for the revolution, Bukharin was sentenced to death after a public trial where he begged Stalin for mercy, pleading with him to spare his life. But mercy was a concept Stalin had abandoned long ago. His true revolution was not about liberation. It was about consolidation of power at any cost. As Stalin's purges intensified, so did his efforts to crush any opposition, real or imagined. The Gulag system expanded rapidly. These labor camps, initially established for political dissidents, were now used to imprison anyone seen as a threat to Stalin's regime. Millions of Soviet citizens were sent to these camps, where they faced forced labor, starvation, and death. It's estimated that between 1.5 and 2 million people perished in the gulags between 1936 and 1938 alone. The camps were notorious for their inhuman conditions. Prisoners were often sent to Siberia, enduring extreme cold, harsh labor and systematic brutality. The most notorious of these camps were in the far north, where temperatures regularly dropped to -50 degrees Celsius. Political prisoners, intellectuals, artists, and scientists were mixed with common criminals, turning these camps into a breeding ground for misery and despair. One survivor, Lev Kopelev, recalled his experiences in a Gulag labor camp. The Gulag is not just a system of forced labor camps. It is a state of mind. It is a place where the human spirit is slowly crushed, where the distinction between the living and the dead becomes blurred, and where one learns that the most terrible thing is not physical suffering, but the complete erasure of one's individuality. The gulags were a tool for re-education through forced labor, and those who were unlucky enough to be sent there often perished from exhaustion, disease, or outright violence. Stalin's vision of the perfect Soviet state came at the expense of millions of lives, and in these camps, Stalin was shaping a society of silence where fear ruled above all. While Stalin's purges decimated the intellectual and political elite, another catastrophe was unfolding. In the early 1930s, Stalin's attempt to collectivize agriculture led to one of the most devastating famines in history. The policy, which forced peasants to surrender their land to collective farms, was a catastrophic failure. Stalin's refusal to acknowledge the situation only worsened the disaster. In Ukraine, one of the breadbaskets of Europe, the effects of Stalin's forced collectivization were felt most acutely. The government requisitioned grain and other foodstuffs to fuel industrialization, leaving millions to starve. The Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, claimed the lives of an estimated 5 million people. Stalin was aware of the crisis, but he turned a blind eye, considering it an effective means of breaking the resistance of the peasantry. A letter from a father to his son in Moscow provides a haunting glimpse into the horror. "My dear son, I am writing to you to tell you that your mother is dead. She died of starvation after months of suffering. I don't have much time left myself." Yet, Stalin's regime continued to insist that the famine was simply a result of poor planning and not a man-made disaster. Foreign visitors, like French deputy Édouard Herriot, were shown only a pre-arranged facade of prosperity, further cementing Stalin's false narrative to the outside world. Stalin, who once promised a utopian society, had created a nightmare, one where millions suffered and died in silence, their suffering ignored by the very leader who caused it. As the purges and famine raged, Stalin tirelessly crafted a cult of personality to cement his irreplaceable position in the Soviet Union. His image was glorified in every corner of the country, from statues to portraits in factories, classrooms, and government offices. He wrote his own biography, which was rewritten to reflect him as the supreme leader. The state media sang his praises, and even ordinary citizens were expected to do the same. Stalin's face appeared on every document and propaganda, becoming synonymous with the Soviet state. His speeches were gospel and his decisions unquestionable. But behind the propaganda, Stalin's personal life was a stark contrast to the idealized figure he had created. Behind Kremlin walls, Stalin was not just a politician, but a husband and father, and his relationships were filled with tension, cruelty, and emotional isolation. Stalin's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was deeply involved in the Bolshevik movement and met Stalin early in the revolution. She was 22 years younger than him, but their shared commitment to the cause brought them together. Their marriage quickly soured. Stalin, who demanded control in both politics and private life, subjected Nadezhda to emotional and physical abuse. As his power grew, so did his cruelty, and their relationship deteriorated. In 1932, after years of suffering, Nadezhda died, officially from appendicitis, though it's believed she took her own life after an argument with Stalin. Her death was shrouded in secrecy. Stalin was reportedly devastated, but some close aides noted his grief seemed more out of pride. He lost control over yet another person in his life. Nadezhda's suicide highlighted the emotional toll of Stalin's rule, even on those closest to him. Yakov Djugashvili, Stalin's eldest son, born to his first wife, Ekaterina Svanidze, grew up with emotional neglect and abuse. Stalin's cold and distant nature left Yakov longing for affection. In 1941, Yakov was captured by the Germans during World War II. Stalin reportedly refused to negotiate for his release, seeing it as a humiliation. Yakov's health deteriorated in captivity, and in 1943, he died under mysterious circumstances. Officially a suicide, though some suggest it was a German execution or even Stalin's order. Stalin's indifferent reaction to Yakov's death was a reflection of his lack of fatherly grief. Vasily Stalin, Stalin's second son with Nadezhda, grew up in the shadow of his father's cruelty. Stalin's neglect and harsh expectations left Vasily emotionally isolated. As an adult, Vasily struggled to find his own identity. Stalin's distrust of him led to a strained relationship, and Vasily spiraled into alcoholism. Despite his father's power, he was emotionally abandoned and dismissed from military academy due to his failures and Stalin's criticism. Vasily's tragic life reflected the emotional neglect he endured. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's only daughter, initially had a close relationship with him, but as she grew older, she became aware of the tyranny that ruled her family. Stalin was emotionally distant, controlling, and quick to anger. As Svetlana entered adolescence, her relationship with Stalin became difficult. She suffered emotional neglect and harsh criticism. In 1967, Svetlana defected to the United States, denouncing both the Soviet regime and her father, shocking the world. Later, Svetlana's life continued to be marked by emotional turmoil. Married 4 times, her children faced tragic fates, and she sought escape through successive marriages. Ultimately, she lived as a lonely exile in the West until her death in 2011. Her story mirrored the emotional scars left by Stalin's reign. By the late 1930s, Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a dictatorship of terror. The purges were not limited to political figures. Ordinary citizens were arrested, imprisoned, or executed for the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, became an omnipresent force, rooting out perceived enemies of the state. One particularly chilling policy was Stalin's quota system for executions. Party officials were given strict quotas for how many people needed to be arrested and executed. Stalin's henchman, Nikolai Yezhov, boasted that they killed people by the thousands, with no regard for innocence or guilt. His directive was clear: strike, exterminate without sorting. Anyone could be an enemy. There was no escape from the ever-watchful eyes of Stalin's regime. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would reveal just how flawed Stalin's leadership truly was. On this day, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler's forces, over 3 million strong, launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, marking the start of Operation Barbarossa. The surprise attack caught Stalin completely off guard. In the months leading up to the invasion, there had been intelligence reports, spies, and warnings. But Stalin, ever paranoid and self-absorbed, dismissed them all. "They're just provocations," he said. Even when a Soviet deserter warned him that the Nazis were preparing to invade, Stalin responded dismissively, "He's a disinformer. He should go to hell." As the German forces advanced rapidly, Stalin disappeared into the depths of the Kremlin, paralyzed by fear. The Soviet army was left to face the Nazis with outdated equipment, ill-prepared officers, and low morale. Stalin's purges had already decimated the officer corps, leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable to Hitler's blitzkrieg. Within weeks, the Nazis had already breached Soviet borders and were advancing on the capital, Moscow. The Russian people were in shock. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, was under direct threat. Citizens filled the streets, waiting for Stalin's guidance. But Stalin was silent. It was Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's deputy, who spoke to the people, delivering the first Soviet public address since the invasion began. Stalin, the great dictator who had prided himself on his control, was nowhere to be found. In the face of disaster, he had become a coward, afraid to face the public and admit his failure. Meanwhile, Stalin's eldest son, Yakov, was captured by the Germans as he fled Moscow, the symbol of Stalin's failure as a father and a leader. It was clear that Stalin's iron grip on the Soviet Union was slipping, and his people were now fighting for survival without his leadership. As the Nazis advanced on Moscow, Stalin's position as the leader of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. However, despite his earlier mistakes, Stalin's resolve hardened in the face of overwhelming odds. Moscow was not to fall, but the real turning point would come in Stalingrad, a battle that would reshape the course of World War II and turn the tide against Nazi Germany. By July 1942, the German army was closing in on Stalingrad, a city named after Stalin himself. The Nazis had already captured 90% of the city, but the Soviet people, including Stalin's own troops, fought to the death. Stalin, for the first time in years, allowed his generals to take control, trusting them with the fate of the battle. General Zhukov devised a plan to encircle the German forces, trapping them in a pocket and forcing them to surrender. November 19th, 1942, saw over 1 million Soviet soldiers and 1,400 tanks surround the Germans. The outcome was nothing short of miraculous. Over 300,000 German soldiers were captured or killed. And for the first time, the Nazis suffered a major defeat on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience, and Stalin, who had failed his people early in the war, finally delivered a victory that would echo through history. The Germans were pushed back, and the Soviet Union began its long counteroffensive to drive the Nazis from its soil. Though the war was far from over, Stalin's victory at Stalingrad did not heal his deepening paranoia. The battle had given him a much-needed victory, but it also deepened his mistrust of his military leaders and his political allies. He feared their growing popularity and influence, and so, once again, he turned to his familiar tool, terror. In 1943, he executed some of the most successful military commanders who had helped win Stalingrad. Marshal Timoshenko and General Rokossovsky, both heroes of the battle, were accused of being enemies of the people, a convenient label Stalin applied to anyone who dared challenge his authority. At the same time, the Soviet state continued to enforce his cult of personality. Stalin's face was now everywhere. His portrait was the centerpiece of nearly every public space, and schools and factories required people to sing his praises daily. However, the war itself had also taken a toll on Stalin's mental state. He became increasingly unstable, withdrawing from public view for long periods of time and showing signs of deteriorating health. His decisions became erratic, and his personal life continued to unravel. His relationship with his daughter Svetlana had grown distant, and she, like many of Stalin's associates, lived in fear of his wrath. Stalin, for all his power, was a deeply lonely and broken man, tormented by the realization that his empire was built on a foundation of fear and death. As the war raged on, Stalin continued to oversee the Soviet military's push westward, eventually reaching Berlin in April 1945. The Red Army would capture the German capital just weeks before the war officially ended in Europe. Yet, while the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, Stalin's personal life was crumbling. Stalin's health had deteriorated, suffering from several heart attacks and strokes, leaving him increasingly incapacitated. In March 1953, after a night of drinking and a heated argument with his aides, Stalin suffered his final stroke. For 2 days, he lay unconscious, his fate sealed. His inner circle, paralyzed by fear, did nothing to help him, fearing that any action could be interpreted as a threat to Stalin's authority. When Stalin died, the Soviet Union entered a period of mourning, but it was a grim silence. The man who had ruled with terror for more than 30 years had passed, but the fear he instilled in his people would last for generations. In Vorkuta Gulag, prisoners cheered at the news of his death, their faces alight with a rare glimpse of freedom. Stalin's reign had come to an end, but the legacy of his terror remained. 20 million people, including peasants, intellectuals, and political rivals, had been killed or imprisoned during his rule. The scars he left on the Soviet Union were deep and would take decades to heal. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union would undergo a de-Stalinization process, led by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes, revealing the extent of the purges and the terror that had defined Stalin's leadership. But for many, Stalin remained an enigma, a man of contradictions, a hero to some, a tyrant to others. The Soviet people, who had been taught to worship him, now struggled to reconcile the man who had promised equality with the man who had sacrificed millions in the name of power. Stalin's final years were filled with fear, confusion, and isolation. But his reign left a scar on history that cannot be erased. a tyrant who reshaped the Soviet Union at the cost of countless lives. His story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and absolute authority.